Welcome to What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future from the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership in partnership with Investec. This series is hosted by Lindsay Hooper and Mark Kahn.
Hello and welcome to What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future, where we explore how leaders can help build future-fit economies. I'm Lindsay Hooper, Chief Executive at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership.
And I'm Mark Kahn, Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer at Investec. Together, we'll bring fresh perspectives, provocative questions, and conversations with leaders who are shaping the future of markets, business, and society.
In today's podcast, we're going to be exploring the shifting narrative around AI, from utopian promise, AI can save the world, to existential fear, recognizing the reality that today, most deployment of AI is frankly focused on accelerating corporate productivity and ultimately profitability. Does the potential still exist for us to harness and deploy this incredibly powerful tool in a way that actually will deliver for human progress, not just corporate profits? And to help us explore this, we're joined today by Vilas Dar. Vilas is a philanthropist, technologist, and a scholar, and he's a leading voice for AI-enabled, human-centered future. As the president of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, he advocates for equity-based approaches to designing products and policies that support a thriving, sustainable, and more inclusive world.
Vilas, we're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you for such a warm welcome, Lindsay and Mark. I'm delighted to be with you.
How would you characterize the current state of play? What's the landscape we're looking at before we turn to what's possible?
I feel like we have brought ourselves into a world where there are those who want to talk about how great technology can be and those who want to talk about how technology might destroy us all. As with most things, in the middle is the truth. Let's start from the cliche, and then we'll find meaning in the nuance. The cliche is, this is probably one of the most transformative moments in the human development. And at the same time, it's happening so quickly that I think we often lack the vocabulary to really understand, conceptualize, and direct what's happening around us. In the early days, this broad optimism, almost unbridled in scope, where we listened to the tech bros tell us how AI would solve every problem. I sat at the United Nations next to the CEO of a major tech company. As he said, I think unironically and with little self-reflection, you all work on human rights, but if we get AI, we'll solve most of these problems for you in the next few years. It's so important to crystallize that moment for me because in many ways that is the worst possible expression of what we could say that AI might be for humanity. From there, we went to existential risk, we went to threats, we went to a very human response of fear, of really worrying about all the ways that this might deeply impact the structures and the assumptions of the society we built. But rather than really engage them through the lens of direct vulnerability and political participation, we sometimes found ourselves distracted by visions of robots and Skynet and Terminators and how AI would kill us all. We missed, unfortunately, some of the necessary nuance to have that conversation in real depth. And now I'm deeply worried, and you asked the state of play today, and I think two things have emerged. On one side, what has become a highly pragmatic, I think often profit-focused mechanism to ask the question, how can we take the most amazing things humanity has ever created and use them to drive short-term revenue? I have no problem with that. I think there are elements of our society that should really focus on it. But on the second, I think a vacuum around some fundamental conversations about how the advent of these tools are testing some very basic economic, social, and cultural underpinnings of our society. Questions like, what is the role of human labor in creating complex products? And that's a question that's asked without a value judgment and without a speculation about what the short-term future of job displacement might look like. I think the bigger question there is over the next 10, 20, or 30 years, if we believe there's a possibility that automation might truly disrupt the fundamental need for human labor, what would we need to do to build a functional society in that new environment? How would we restructure the ways we think about opportunity, about access, about dignity in work in a world where we have much more optionality? On one side, we have, as quickly as we can run towards a goal, a number of companies trying to develop new AI-based tools. And on the other, a real vacuum around how we're beginning to think about the long-term societal implications of these tools. And I think we probably need to adjust and balance both of those dynamics at the same time.
So, Vilas, let me come in on that balancing frame that you've just given. When I listen to others that bring in concerns, essentially, they wander along the following lines. They say previous technological innovations, historically, everything from the controller fire all up until the internet and so forth, the single most important characteristic that they worry about when they look at the previous technological innovations and artificial intelligence as a comparative is control. And what I mean by that, there is an assumption, and I'm wanting to test this assumption, that this technological evolution is different from previous evolutions because for the very first time, we may not as a species be in control of our own decision-making and destiny. And the technology that we give birth to may be in control. And this presents all sorts of, as you put it, cultural, social, and political challenges. What is your view on that perspective?
Certainly, there is a conversation about control, about what decisions these systems might be able to make without human intervention. And then there is a little bit of sci-fi speculation that's been brought into that very narrow domain. So this question of control, I think, reflects more of an internal human angst than it does a scientific reality of what the AI systems we're building are. But let me expand the aperture. If we move away from control, and I ask instead a different question, if you want to reason by historical allegory, think back to the Industrial Revolution, and I would ask you to consider one specific phenomenon. When we built these new machines that transformed how labor interacted with capital, one of the things we saw was a very quick imbalance in the power of that relationship. It went to those who had the capacity to buy these machines, to build factories, and we saw a massive move of power from workers to employers. And then, over the course of almost 100 years of deeply traumatic activity, we found a new balance, a balance that was conditioned in legislative and policy action around labor rights, around the creation of social structures like unions, around a new market dynamic that emerged between the people who are employing and those who knew how to work the machines that had been developed. The point to take away from this is it took 100 years for us to incorporate a technological revolution into our social and economic structures, 100 years that was marked by some of the most flagrant abuses of the human relationship, from child labor and the creation of company towns, working conditions that were miserable for people, and the social and political unrest that was fomented by that.
Okay, so what are the implications for today?
AI will not give us 100 years. It might give us a decade. The challenges and the fears that I have more to do with the fact of if we deploy these tools without really understanding what their impacts will be, what kind of social and political frictions are we going to create? And do we have the resiliency to actually be able to deal with them? I'm not worried about an AI system 100 years from now that decides that humans are bad. I'm worried about 10 years from now, whether we have the capacity to deal with what happens when millions of people feel not just displaced, but fully kicked out of a social contract that hasn't really worked for them for decades. These are the worries that I think we should be holding together. I'm quite an optimistic person, but I'm very realistic as well. Like, these are the things that we need to be investing in. And if we want to have a sci-fi discussion about control of AI systems, great. Let's just make sure that doesn't become the only focal point of a conversation about AI risk.
I'm interested to pick up on this hypothesis that we have a vacuum, that we need to be thinking, engaging more around the economic, the social, the cultural dimensions of this. So there's not a complete vacuum, though, is there? There are surely some people who actually do have some quite clear views. Some of them publish manifestos online around how they see the future playing out and views about how they think society could and should play out and what AI will enable. Perhaps reassure me that actually, no, there are no dystopian fantasies out there about what this is going to enable.
You've set me quite a challenge if you want me to reassure you about that one. But let's start with dystopian fantasies. And you mentioned a manifesto, one that's quite famous, of course, that's come out of one of the Silicon Valley organizations and people. I want to start with that. And I want to start with a phenomenon that has long emerged in the technological world, but I think is hypercrystallized in the AI era, which is a postulate for some that technical prowess equals moral authority. That because you are the CEO of a large technology company, you somehow have a unique insight into what the shape of our society should be. Now, I have to tell you, I am a computer scientist, a technologist. I've been involved with technology companies my entire life. And again, I want to acknowledge that some of these companies hold some of the most innovative and visionary people in terms of their capacity to build tools. But there's nothing in the language I just used that also says that they are somehow better situated to make decisions about how my life goes or yours does, about how billions of people experience the world around them. So while it is true that we've had many strong voices in the space and we see them in the headlines all day long today, often senior leadership at technology companies telling us what an AI future will look like, I reject the premise. Instead, I ask the question, if we're talking about the future of billions of people on this planet, the only voices that are relevant and legitimate to me are those billions of voices. Now, through the structures of representative democracy, of who those great thinkers are that are building movements at scale, but to simply not allow them to be in the conversation, I think is just a fundamental failure on our part. So when I talk about a vacuum, I actually think about three different pieces of the structure that I think we need to enable and strengthen so that they can really be a part of this debate. The first is, as you have said, I lead a philanthropy, a foundation, really an archetype that was developed in the 20th century, a way to think about public capital as a way to supplement and support both government action and what's happening in the private sector. Many would say philanthropy is designed to cure market failures. And while I think that's quite an aspirational frame, I do think a lot about the role of civil society in particular in defining some of the decisions that we need to make and making sure that voices are represented. Now, I will say, and this is a broad brush critique and apologize for its bluntness, I think there's much more nuance to be held in a longer conversation. But in many ways, civil society has stayed out of the digital transformation of our society over the last 25 years, with, of course, amazing and notable exceptions. But broadly, organizations that have worked on things like malnutrition or political participation or climate haven't really engaged in questions about what the internet was doing to the information ecosystem, and maybe much more painfully, how social media was transforming our engagement with each other. I think this can't continue.
So how do we involve civil society in this?
Civil society needs to not just be involved, but needs to lead in bringing perspectives from the front lines of vulnerability. These are perspectives about basic issues like privacy from surveillance, about autonomy and political dignity, but also about economic participation in the benefits of AI, how communities actually become not just consumers, but real architects of technology. The second sector is government. One of the things I've been deeply troubled by is this frame that often comes out of technology companies that government's role is simply to sit back and potentially, when they see technology company overreach, to use regulation as a way of bounding it. To me, this is a fundamental corruption of what the idea of good governance is. We build governments to represent the interests of the public. And to me, governments who say we are merely regulators abrogate their responsibility to define what a positive future of a technology-enabled society might look like, to leverage all of the tools that they have access to, like public capital, like the use of investments in new technologies, certainly, but in public infrastructure for AI, in ensuring that our academic institutions are actually training for the future, and in building mechanisms to think about how people might actually participate in creating AI tools at scale. And the third is considering where we build the institutions that actually guide and protect this conversation over the next 50 years. I think by analog to the 1930s in the United States, a place that was characterized by broad and widespread disease, malaria, dengue, and any number of other things. Over the course of only about 10 years, we built an entire infrastructure for public health in the United States. I think for AI, we need something quite similar. We need to think about who will tend and curate data sets at scale, who will ensure that we are training for the future, and who will ensure that we're putting in the policy and regulatory frameworks that actually protect this for all of us.
Okay, so what will this look like in practice?
I don't think we can look to the existing institutions of today and say we're going to add new mandates for you. Instead, we need to engage in what Roberto Unger called the institutional imagination, the idea that we can actually build new structures that create new resilience.
So, Vilas, let's put a lens on everything we've been saying here from a geopolitical race for AI between states. And in particular, I'm referring to China and the United States, but there are other nation states that are intricately involved in this type of race. So we do see a geopolitical race to achieve one-upmanship, if you like, between them. And I wonder how you see that playing out in view of your earlier optimism that the necessary institutional cooperation could produce an environment that would be more sustainable in the future with regard to this technology.
In that question is a combination of issues, and I'd love to pull them apart, and we'll go through them. As you both know, I had the great honor and privilege of being asked by the Secretary General of the UN to join a high-level advisory body on AI. And it was constituted of 38 experts from across the world, Chinese experts and Americans, Russians and Saudis and Indians, and the full kind of global participation. And it was a place where we were able to truly dig into these questions that you've asked, not through the lens of each individual advocating for their own nation state, but to ask a question, what's the point of all of this? What are we solving for? You used the term, and I think it was such an appropriate one, that so much of the conversation today about AI dominance is really about that one-upmanship. I don't know that there's a defined goal for what countries are looking for when they talk about domination in AI. I think instead there's a more atavistic response, right? We want to be at the lead of the thing, but we don't know what the thing is yet. And I think it can actually be quite a distracting approach. So let me instead suggest a few things that came to us as we negotiated at a very high level, international level, on what AI should look like and what the dynamics of state level action might be. The first was this idea that came to us very early on in the process that said trying to create walled gardens of AI never worked for the internet. It never worked for any number of other domains. Trying to put arbitrary political boundaries on what is a technology that will very easily evade border controls seemed like a bad starting point. That actually there were incredible advantages that came to regional scale. From a broad-based lens, the idea of individual nation sovereignty and the physical infrastructure of AI just doesn't seem to lead to very positive outcomes for anyone. It leads to incredible inefficiencies. The second thing that became very apparent was that AI has become political, or maybe that politics have been imposed on AI at a national level and a domestic level here in the United States, certainly at a global level as well. And when that happens, we see some phenomenon emerging. First, that AI, which really has been a global conversation, in which there are a multipolar set of capacities. For example, we often leave out the EU's incredible investment and capacity around building AI at scale. The British capacity, the Indian capacity, often becomes reduced to a US-China conversation. And I think that's more a function of political outcomes and consequences than it is a real scientific understanding of where development of AI tools are happening at scale. And when that happens, I think we risk losing sight of some of the possibilities that would happen if we built a truly global mechanism for developing AI. And then the last thing I'll say is to recognize that it may be that we are setting up a fight that we don't need to have. That it's not yet clear how national dominance on AI systems actually translates directly into national trade positionality or into any number of other kind of economic and social competitive fights. It might be the case that collaborating on AI would actually lead to, and I hate to say this because again, you will hear it as potentially too optimistic, but the tide that lifts all boats, that actually building some foundational AI capacity might actually make us better at doing everything from driving more productivity in our fields on corn and rice and wheat, all the way through to the delivery of public benefits by increasing government architecture.
Do you see already now some actions or examples which would underwrite the optimism that you are filled with?
Oh, absolutely. And I'd love to tell you about them. I'll start with an example that comes from the climate space. 10 years ago, as we started to think about this, one of my hypotheses here was that we could actually deeply energize climate advocacy and give it a new form of intellectual grounding if we could build the kinds of data and AI resources that stood apart from and across any number of organizations, but gave them a universal set of ground truths. And as we looked, one of the questions was, what institution exists today that can hold that? And it was really quite hard to find one organization that could serve as a repository for global climate data at scale. Everything from geospatial intelligence and climate sensing, from sensor information in the oceans, from tree and land cover and carbon assessments, all the way through to the lived experience of coastal and indigenous communities. We started from a sense of saying we need this to exist. What institution can hold it? And it very quickly became clear that because of the dynamics of climate advocacy, the politicization of the space, sustainability issues, and many numbers, no single institution could hold it. The product of that realization over 10 years is now something called Climate Trace. And Climate Trace is a fascinating example of what happens when you bring multi-sectoral approaches together to solve a problem. It starts from a vulnerability. How do we ensure that communities have access to local knowledge about emissionality in their own environments? How do we ensure that everybody's operating from a base of common knowledge and that we have a way to align social sector and advocacy interests with private and commercial interests? The product of that now is a distributed system that incorporates hundreds of nonprofits and private sector contributors who contribute their own information, data, and knowledge about carbon and emissionality into one system. That system then applies some pretty nuanced and sophisticated data gathering and AI tools that now lets anybody, you and me, go online to climatetrace.org, plug in your address, and see the sources of carbon emissionality in your own community. And as we think about what the institutional architecture of the AI-enabled world looks like, this is one example among many that shows that when you start from vulnerability, when you realize there's also an economic framework that allows for incentives to be built around it, when you bring technologists who have real purpose attached to their work, and you're able to conceptualize what that looks like in new and decentralized ways, you can build things that change the world.
Some great examples there. And I think there's also a lot of concern about, but what do we focus on? Do we focus on all of the opportunities and some of the inspiring great examples you've laid out? We institutionally have a number of startups who are absolutely drawing on AI capabilities to accelerate positive impact. Or should we all be focusing on the energy issue? Or should we focus actually on the destabilization and erosion of even our ability to respond and democracy and the conditions for global cooperation? So I'm interested if you're speaking directly to those members of our community that are more squarely in the sustainability space, what would your advice be to them about how best to engage?
That's a great question. I would start from this idea that AI can actually help us understand our planet, can help us build new and innovative tools. It can really help us reshape the way that we think about climate activity, but only if we first understand AI. Right? There is this piece missing here that says, how do we just use it as a tool, but without actually understanding what it's good for and how it can be helpful, but also how it can be harmful, we risk deploying it into situations that we don't understand. Models in AI that are trained on biased or incomplete logic can often give us wrong answers. And again, if you are simply thinking about it as a plugin and you say, I'm doing X, I'm going to use AI to do X a little bit faster, you miss a lot of that nuance. But I think in that conundrum actually lies the opportunity that leadership in this space is going to require a combination of deep problem knowledge and intuition, which I think many of our folks do, a sense of technological awareness. And that doesn't mean everybody needs to be an AI scientist, but to understand the nuances of these things. One of the conversations that's been happening recently in the public headlines, of course, is how AI is going to destroy local sustainability. It's going to suck up all the water and all the power. And I think that's an incredibly important conversation, but it's a conversation that requires nuance, that we actually have also built very small scale models that actually do a lot of AI work at the edge, particularly for climate functions that are actually incredibly productive. Sometimes the things we're talking about are the massive, almost ego-driven projects of, I need $500 billion to build a data center in Texas that will destroy local water tables. That story doesn't describe all of AI. But as we think about this broader story, then, as you go from how does AI affect it, I think the third piece that you need if you have problem definition and you have technical awareness is we need a new form of moral courage. We need an understanding that because these technologies are impacting people's lives in so many different ways, we can no longer think about the goals of a single organization as being about a single topic of advocacy. They have to be deeply integrated back into the needs of the communities that you're advocating for. We need a new form of humility over hype, is the way I describe it. That you have to be able to balance all of the things that you say you'll be able to do with AI with a recognition that we need a new kind of foresight also about what the effects of this will be on people.
Okay, but that's not going to be easy. How are we going to achieve that?
We need technologists and policymakers and civil society advocates to actually work together on these questions, because as much as I might advocate for the idea that we need civil society to be owners of technology creation, I still deeply believe that the engine of innovation will be in private sector companies. We have to find new bridges for them to actually be able to engage with each other and do more real-time transfer of possibility so that we can build solutions that address the problems that billions of people face on this planet.
So I'm finding it quite encouraging, your optimism around what's possible. That is hugely reassuring. And I'm feeling that I'm coming in slightly as a naysayer or looking for problems. But I'm sitting with a nervousness that there's some brilliant thinking and philanthropy and creative solutions around what's possible. But that's still in the philanthropic space. You earlier alluded to a need for this kind of to be embraced by markets. We need commercial responses. And my nervousness that all the corporate giants and all the commercial capital is not headed in that same direction. So I'm interested in how are we going to get that jump across from what's absolutely possible and proven, funded predominantly through philanthropy, into harnessing the power of the global economy. And then when we get to democratization, I know that there's a level of cynicism or skepticism around, but will citizens really engage? They'll fill in surveys that say they're concerned, but they will still absolutely want to be able to get the benefits. What's the quickest route to get to a coffee shop? Or how do I organize my shopping list? The convenience that's provided might outweigh their drive and hunger to want democratization and to engage and see these as tools to have a voice in shaping their futures.
I want to clarify that my optimism is not an optimism about inevitability, but an optimism about alternative approaches. And what I mean by that is I recognize the way the world is structured and the ways that we are pursuing so many different pathways. I just want to make sure that we hold a common truth that inertia does not equal inevitability, that because we're on that path doesn't mean that we can't do better. So that's where the optimism comes from. I want to address your second question because I think it's so important, is do we believe, do we trust that people want to make better choices? That convenience isn't the only thing that will drive them? I think this is quite an important question. I think as we look at the history, particularly of the last 30 or 40 years of the internet and social media, and I talk to people all across the world from very different communities and different lived experiences, what I think I hear more uniformly than anything else is a shared sense of a loss of agency, a sense that it's not really our decision to make. When I ask a question like, would you prefer social media be like this instead of that? People will say, it's not really my choice. To me, there are so many things that we worry about. And one of them, as I've said many times in this call, is will the robots take over and kill us all? But maybe much more acute for me is this question of if we live in a world where people simply have thrown up their hands and said, I don't have any ability to influence that decision, what does that mean for our basic structures of democratic participation? So I think we need to change that. I think the way we change it is by demonstrating all of the different ways that we have actually all of these new forms of access. And here, philanthropic capital has been essential over the last 10 years, simply because I think that sector was one of the first to actually step in and start investing in this work. That we had a dominant narrative that had been given by technology companies. And here we were beginning to say, what if we made some investments in building AI solutions for hyper-local problems that transform lives? I could give you a million examples, but suffice it to say that for the communities that were participants in these experiments, they found that AI was no longer something that they downloaded on their phone and used without control over their data or anything else. There were things that they actively built that actually transformed their capacity to solve a problem. But in order to take those pilots, those projects, and turn them into platforms that actually affect the world at large, we need something very different, because the scope and scale of philanthropic funding is nowhere near the amount necessary. And I have two hopes that we're beginning to realize in early ways. The first is, as we continue to invest in civil society, experimenting with these tools and building them at scale, governments are taking notice. And the ability to unlock public financing to build these kinds of tools at scale, I think, is incredibly hopeful. We're seeing the creation of multi-billion-dollar investment vehicles that sit as matters of public financing that can find and scale these. I think about here in the United States, we have things like the Peace Corps and AmeriCorps pathways for people to spend 2 years of their life engaging in public service around the world. What if we could build programs like that for people who had deep technological competency, who are AI experts, to say, I'm going to spend 2 years of my life in civic service, bringing my AI competency to a community organization that's building tools at scale. What would that look like if we could build a global mechanism to do something quite similar? And the second part of it, and here I come back to my deep conviction that there are no villains in any part of the story, is I actually think technology companies are an incredibly positive contributor and participant in this story of what we need to build. And I see it in the ways that the large AI companies are building global impact and social impact programs. And you might think of these organizations as hegemonic, monolithic, one institution with a particularly flamboyant CEO. But they're made up of engineers and scientists, of people who work across every job discipline, who have deep moral compasses, who want to bring what they know how to do to build products at scale. And so, again, I asked the question, if we took some of these companies and asked them, even as they continue to build their kind of market-facing products, build also the solutions that transform health access, that transform our understanding of what's happening in our oceans and in our skies, any number of other social impact outcomes. That's a pathway to scale that's totally underdeveloped. I think we could do that by building new bridges between civil society and the private sector to create these problem definitions that have secondary effects. They open up new markets, they build new consumers, they do all kinds of things that are actually aligned to for-profit interests as well.
The kind of leadership that is needed to go forward here is in many respects quite unique. I think, Vilas, if we picked up the kind of leadership that's needed in your view here to take us forward, most leaders have got no idea, and I include myself in that, what's really at stake here. So most of the people that I speak to from a leadership point of view in the commercial world are at 6s and 7s when it comes to understanding how to make sense of the new technological innovation that is upon us. And the speed at which it is moving and changing is so fast that by the time they capture a single point of understanding, it's already moved beyond that. So I would characterize the current state of leadership as overwhelmed, would be the word that I'd use. And yet at the same time, I'm not sure there is a more important call to leaders than now. What's your view on this? How should leaders think about this?
There is a fundamental difference in how our society thinks about leadership. On one side is the expectation we have of leaders of being those who are great at reacting to change, and the capacities and competencies and skills that become necessary in order to actively monitor and respond to the changes that are happening. I think in many ways we lionize that set of activities too much, and we under-prioritize another form of leadership, one that I hold quite dear, which is actually about understanding the world we have today and creating the change that's necessary, that actually transforms our capacity to be active, collaborative, and inspired participants. I think as I think about the world today, I see 3 trains all barreling at each other in some sort of weird railway map. On one, we have the society we built, the society that has embedded in it core values and approaches that have worked for some but have not worked for so many others. A second train, that's the promise of technological disruption. All of the ways that these consequences of what will happen that we don't fully understand, and I think we sometimes don't even have the vocabulary to describe. And then there's a third train on the tracks, and that train is assuming that everything is up for reimagination. What new principles and values, what new approaches, what new moral courage will we bring to the discussion to envision things that have never existed and say, how do we build them? It sometimes feels like people pick one train to be on, and they're on that train, and that's the conversation they want to have. But the convergence of these 3 phenomena are happening, and they're going to happen very quickly. And in that moment, to come back to leadership, the question becomes, who will hold the moral courage to say that whatever it is that we create has to work for everyone? To me, that's what leadership has to be. And if that's our expectation of our leaders, then my question is, do we have the right people in place? And if not, what are we going to do about that? To me, that should be the challenge that we spend our time on, again, with hope and optimism, but also to recognize that there are voices and perspectives across our planet and our society who have such incredible contributions to make. Have we created space for them to be a part of that conversation? Will we commit to making this a participatory future?
I love the framing. And we know in a range of domains, we're hearing a lot more calls for moral courage. That's really, over recent years, increasingly rising up the agenda as something that people are clearly feeling a deficit of and are feeling a real attraction towards and a need for that. I'm interested in where you see that exemplified to bring to life. I realize that there's also a challenge of putting on a pedestal any kind of heroic leader because no one's perfect, but really interested in what you would see as great examples of leadership that we can learn from.
I love that question. I will say the individuals who are saying, from a perspective of supporting workers around the world, what do we need to do to transform the capacity of labor movements to step forward and advocate for dignity in an increasingly automated world? I will talk about those people who stand against the prevailing political winds and say we need to stand up for the basic sense of our identities in this world and what values and morals drive our national character, of what we do in a rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape to ensure that we're standing up for multilateralism, not to simply think about how our country stands as dominant, but rather how we build for everyone. I see it in technology communities where people say we're building not simply because we can, but because there are real problems we have to solve. And sometimes we will divert our attention and our resources from the most profitable activity to the most purposeful one. I see it in academic communities and civil society communities and private sector communities. I see it everywhere, Lindsay. Sometimes all we need to do is stop and recognize that people will do the right thing, that they will do the right thing in communities and in ways that actually shape our future. And sometimes our only role is to remove the barriers and obstacles to making sure that they have that choice.
I have just one final question. How you stay optimistic and resilient and be able to keep standing up and be in the creative space as well that gives the space for new ideas and new principles to emerge.
Thanks for asking. I have this incredible privilege of the job that I have, which I've been able to create from whole cloth in some ways. But one of the commitments that I have made with our incredibly gracious board and with our staff is I don't have an office. I spend nearly every day, I travel 360 odd days a year with communities at the front lines of transformation and vulnerability around the world. Many of my days start with waking up in farm towns, in shipbuilding yards, in manufacturing centers, in frontline communities that are experiencing climate change, access to healthcare issues and education, places in some of the most remote parts of the world and in some of the most urban centers. And what really gives me a great deal of energy every day as I wake up is recognizing that even as we take on what feel like globally transformative challenges, the true courage, the dignity of humanity is uniform and universal. That people care about some pretty basic things that are shared among all of us. They care about doing the right thing. They care about security and safety for their people. They care about opportunity. They care about their capacity and their agency to realize their visions of what's possible for themselves, for their children, for their neighbors, and for their people. And I think that we sometimes miss that very basic foundational truth that should be a part of every conversation we have in policy and in decision-making, the incredible power of humanity as a collective force to do good for each other, for ourselves, for the planet around us.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Vilas. And it's encouraging to hear your optimistic and passionate views on the potential for AI to be a force for good. Join us next time on What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future.
This show is presented by Lindsay Hooper, Chief Executive of CISL, and Mark Kahn, Investec's Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer. The producers are Carl Homer of Cambridge TV and Alexa Selwood. The executive producer is Gillian Secret, and it's produced in partnership with Investec. Thank you for listening. For more episodes, subscribe on any major podcast platform or visit the Leadership Hub on the CISL website or Investec Focus. You'll find the address in the show notes.